Welcome to Monk's Temple. There's a specific kind of silence that fills a room when someone you love has already left, even though their body remains. It's not the comfortable silence of two people reading together, or the peaceful silence after making love. It's a hollow silence. A silence that echoes. A silence that tells you, more clearly than any words could, that something vital has departed. Most of us have sat in that silence at some point in our lives. We've looked across the dinner table at someone we once couldn't keep our hands off, and felt nothing where everything used to be. We've reached for a hand that reached back out of habit rather than desire. We've said, "I love you," and heard the words land like stones instead of feathers. And every time, we've done the same thing. We've told ourselves stories. We've explained it away. We've called it a rough patch, a phase, a temporary difficulty that will pass if we just try hard enough. We've fought against the evidence of our own senses because the alternative, admitting that love might be dying, feels too terrifying to contemplate. But what if the terror is misplaced? What if the death of love isn't something to fear at all? The Buddha looked at the nature of human experience with a clarity that has rarely been matched. What he saw, what he spent 45 years teaching, was that everything without exception is impermanent. The mountains you admire are slowly crumbling. The stars you gaze at are burning out. The body you inhabit is aging and changing with every breath. And the love you feel, as real and profound as it is subject to the same law. This wasn't pessimism. It wasn't nihilism. It was simply accurate observation. The Buddha wasn't saying that love isn't beautiful or meaningful or worth experiencing. He was saying that its beauty and meaning are deepened, not diminished, by its impermanence. Just as the cherry blossom is more precious because it falls, just as the sunset is more stunning because it fades, love gains something from its temporary nature that permanence could never provide. But we've been trained to see it differently. From the fairy tales of childhood to the romantic comedies of adulthood, we've been fed a single message relentlessly: real love lasts forever. If it ends, it wasn't real. If you lose it, you failed. If you let go, you didn't care enough. This message has caused more suffering than almost any other human belief. It has kept people trapped in dead relationships for decades. It has turned natural endings into bitter battles. It has convinced millions that they are somehow broken because something that was always meant to be temporary eventually completed its cycle. I want to tell you a story about a man named Daniel who learned to see through this illusion. Daniel was a high school teacher, 43 years old, married for 16 years to a woman named Claire. They had 2 children, a comfortable home, a life that looked from the outside like everything anyone could want. But Daniel had been noticing something for about 2 years that he couldn't quite name. Claire was still there. She still did all the things a wife does. But something had gone out of her eyes. He would catch her looking at him sometimes, and there was a distance there that hadn't existed before. She would touch him, but the touch felt automatic rather than intentional. She would ask about his day, but he could tell she wasn't really listening to the answer. Daniel did what most people do. He tried harder. He planned a surprise vacation. He bought flowers for no reason. He initiated conversations about their relationship, hoping to find the right words that would bring her back. Nothing worked. The distance remained. The silence in their home grew heavier. One evening, after another failed attempt to connect, Daniel found himself sitting alone in his garage, not doing anything, just sitting. And in that stillness, a thought arose that he had been avoiding for 2 years. The thought was simple and devastating: she's already gone. Not physically, not legally, but essentially. The woman he married, the woman who had looked at him with love and desire, no longer existed. In her place was someone kind and familiar, but fundamentally different. Someone who was going through the motions of a marriage that had already ended. Daniel sat with that thought for a long time. He felt the grief of it, the loss of it, the sheer unfairness of it. And then, slowly, something else arose. A question. What if I've been fighting against something that isn't an enemy? What if this ending, this completion, is exactly what needs to happen? Over the following months, Daniel approached Claire differently. He stopped trying to pull her back. He stopped the desperate efforts to rekindle something that had naturally burned out. He started simply being present with what was actually there, rather than constantly reaching for what used to be. This shift changed everything. Not in the way he had originally hoped, not by bringing Claire back, but by allowing them both to be honest. They started having real conversations for the first time in years. Conversations about what had changed, about the ways they had grown apart, about the love that still existed but had transformed into something different. They divorced about a year later, but it was the kind of divorce that people marvel at. Cooperative. Honest. Even loving in its own way. Daniel often says now that the greatest gift he ever gave Claire was letting her go. And the greatest gift she ever gave him was showing him that letting go wasn't the same as giving up. It was simply accepting what was true. If you're recognizing yourself in Daniel's story, if you're feeling that familiar ache of loving someone who has already left, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. This is your journey, and every step matters. Click the subscribe button below and commit to staying with this exploration. When the Buddha sat under the Bodhi tree more than 2,000 years ago, he wasn't trying to start a religion. He wasn't trying to create beliefs for people to follow. He was doing something much more radical. He was observing the nature of reality with such sustained attention that the veils of illusion began to fall away. What he saw changed everything. He saw that suffering is not optional. It comes with being human. But he also saw that the vast majority of our suffering, the kind that keeps us up at night, the kind that poisons our relationships, the kind that makes us old before our time, is self-inflicted. It comes from one source and one source only: our resistance to what is. We want things to be different than they are. We want people to love us who have stopped loving us. We want relationships to continue that have naturally ended. We want the impermanent to be permanent. And because we want what cannot be, we suffer. This is not complicated. It's actually quite simple. But simple doesn't mean easy. And the reason it's not easy is that our wanting, our clinging, our desperate grasping feels like love. It disguises itself as devotion. It wears the mask of commitment. It tells us that holding on, even when holding on causes pain, is proof of how much we care. The Buddha called this clinging by a specific name. He called it upadana. It means fuel, the fuel that keeps the fire of suffering burning. And he identified 4 kinds of clinging that trap us. Clinging to sensory pleasures. Clinging to views and opinions. Clinging to rituals and routines. And most relevant to our exploration, clinging to the belief in a permanent self. This last one is subtle but crucial. We cling not only to people and relationships, but to the identity we've built around them. We are not just losing a partner. We are losing the story of who we are as someone's partner. We are losing the future we had imagined. We are losing the version of ourselves that existed within that relationship. And this is why letting go is so difficult. It's not just releasing another person. It's releasing a version of yourself. It's allowing that self to die so that a new self can be born. Let me tell you a story about a woman named Carmen who faced this directly. Carmen was a musician, 37 years old, in a relationship with a man named Tomas for 9 years. They had met at a music festival, bonded over their love of jazz, and quickly become inseparable. They composed together, performed together, built their lives around each other. Everyone who knew them assumed they would be together forever. But somewhere around year 7, Carmen began to notice something. When she imagined her future, Tomas was still in it. But when she was actually with Tomas, in the present moment, something was missing. Not dramatically missing. Not obviously missing. But missing nonetheless. A certain aliveness that had been there in the beginning had gradually faded. She ignored it at first. She told herself that all relationships settle, that the initial excitement naturally mellows, that what they had was deeper than mere excitement. But the feeling persisted. And over time, it grew. The moment of clarity came during a performance. They were playing a piece they had written together years ago, a piece that had always felt like an expression of their connection. And as Carmen played her part, she looked over at Tomas and realized with a shock that she felt nothing. No particular warmth. No particular closeness. Just the familiarity of someone she had been making music with for a long time. After the show, she sat alone in the green room and let herself feel the full weight of that realization. The man she loved, the man she had built her life around, no longer moved her. The relationship that had defined her adult existence had become habit. She was staying not because she wanted to, but because she was afraid of who she would be without him. This is the clinging to self that the Buddha spoke of. Carmen wasn't just afraid of losing Tomas. She was afraid of losing the Carmen who existed in relation to Tomas. The musician who had a creative partner. The woman who had a story to tell about her 9-year relationship. The person whose identity was woven together with another person's. It took her another year to act on this realization. A year of honest conversations with Tomas, of therapy, of long nights staring at the ceiling wondering if she was making a terrible mistake. But eventually, she did what she knew she had to do. She ended the relationship. The first year was brutal. Carmen didn't know who she was. Her music suffered. Her sense of self felt like it had been dismantled piece by piece. But somewhere in the second year, something began to shift. She started writing again, but differently. Music that was hers alone, not shaped by years of collaboration. She started discovering parts of herself that had been dormant, interests and preferences and ways of being that had been subsumed by the relationship. By the third year, Carmen could look back and see clearly. The relationship hadn't failed. It had completed. It had given her 9 years of music and love and growth. And then it had naturally ended, making space for something new. Not a new relationship, at least not yet, but a new relationship with herself. A self that was not defined by any other person. This is the freedom that becomes available when we stop clinging. Not freedom from pain, but freedom from the suffering that comes from fighting reality. Not freedom from loss, but freedom to experience loss cleanly, without the added layer of self-destruction. There's a question that haunts almost everyone who has ever loved and lost. The question is simple but devastating: was it real? If it ended, if they stopped loving me, if we grew apart, does that mean what we had was never real in the first place? This question causes immense suffering because it's built on a false premise. The premise is that real love must be permanent. That if something ends, it wasn't authentic. That the only love worth having is love that lasts forever. But consider this. Was your childhood real, even though you're no longer a child? Was the joy of your first kiss less real because that relationship eventually ended? Was the beauty of a sunset diminished because the sun eventually set? Of course not. We don't apply this standard to anything else in life. Only love gets burdened with this impossible demand. The Buddha understood this clearly. He taught that the mistake isn't in loving. The mistake is in expecting love to remain unchanged in a world where everything changes. The mistake is in building our house on ground that we know is shifting and then being surprised when it shifts. Let me tell you a story about a man named Richard who wrestled with this question. Richard was 61 years old when his wife of 34 years passed away from cancer. Margaret had been his high school sweetheart, the love of his life, the person around whom he had built his entire existence. They had raised children together, weathered crises together, grown old together. And now she was gone. In the months after her death, Richard found himself tormented by a question that surprised him. Not the usual grief questions about why or how he would go on. A different question. Was our love real? Did it matter? If it could end, if she could be here one day and gone the next, was any of it meaningful? He knew, intellectually, that this was grief talking. He knew that 34 years of marriage didn't become unreal just because death intervened. But knowing it intellectually and feeling it in his bones were two different things. One day, Richard's daughter brought him a box of old letters. Letters Margaret had written him during the first years of their marriage, when he was deployed overseas. He hadn't seen them in decades. He sat down to read them, not sure what he was looking for. The first letter was dated 1987. Margaret's handwriting was young and eager. She wrote about her day, about missing him, about the tiny apartment they had just bought together. She wrote about their future with a certainty that only the young possess. Richard cried reading it, not just from grief but from the sheer force of her presence coming through those pages. He read another, and another. Hours passed. And somewhere in the middle of that stack of yellowing paper, Richard had a realization. The love in these letters was real. It was undeniably, incontrovertibly real. You could no more fake this kind of writing than you could fake a heartbeat. And yet, the woman who wrote them was gone. The love they shared, as real as it was, had ended. But had it? Richard sat with that question. The love hadn't ended. It had transformed. It had become something else. It had become these letters, this history, these 3 children, these decades of shared life. The love hadn't disappeared. It had just changed form. This is what the Buddha meant when he talked about impermanence. Not that things disappear, but that they transform. The wave doesn't cease to exist when it crashes. It becomes the ocean. The cloud doesn't die when it rains. It becomes the river, the soil, the flower. The love doesn't end when the relationship changes. It becomes memory, wisdom, the capacity to love again. Richard began to see his marriage differently. Not as something that had ended, but as something that had completed its natural cycle. The form had changed, but the essence continued. In his children, in his memories, in the person he had become through 34 years of loving Margaret. This realization didn't erase his grief. He still missed her every day. But it changed the quality of his grief. It became softer, more bearable, infused with gratitude rather than just loss. He could look at their time together and feel thankful rather than cheated. He could hold the letters and feel her presence rather than her absence. Richard's story points to something essential. The question isn't whether love was real. The question is whether we can learn to love knowing it will end, and love fully anyway. Whether we can pour ourselves into connection without demanding guarantees. Whether we can let the wave rise and crash and rise again, without clinging to any single form. This is the practice that Buddhism offers. Not avoiding love to avoid loss, but loving so completely that loss becomes part of love rather than its opposite. Not building walls against impermanence, but opening so fully to each moment that permanence becomes irrelevant. When you look at a forest, what do you see? Most people see trees, individually standing, separate from each other. But a forest ecologist will tell you something different. They'll tell you that what appears separate is actually connected by an underground network of fungi, sometimes called the Wood Wide Web. Through this network, trees share nutrients, send warnings, even keep dying stumps alive by feeding them from their own roots. There's a profound teaching in this for anyone willing to receive it. What looks like separation is often connection in disguise. What appears to be an ending is often a transformation that we simply can't see from our limited perspective. The Buddha taught that our perception is conditioned. We see what we've been trained to see. We interpret what we see through stories we've been told. And most of those stories, when it comes to love and loss, are wrong. Let me tell you a story about a woman named Yuki who discovered this through an unlikely source. Yuki was a Japanese-American woman living in Seattle, 41 years old, recently divorced after a 15-year marriage. The divorce had been her idea, which made it no less painful. She had loved her husband, Kenji, deeply. But somewhere around year 12, she had realized something she couldn't unsee. They were more like roommates than lovers. More like friends than partners. The romance had quietly died, and what remained was companionship without passion. Kenji had been devastated when she told him. He wanted to fight for the marriage, to go to counseling, to find their way back to each other. Yuki agreed to try, mostly out of guilt. They spent a year in therapy, a year of date nights and scheduled intimacy and conversations that went nowhere. And at the end of that year, Yuki knew what she had known at the beginning. The love was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer the kind of love that a marriage is built on. The divorce was amicable by most standards, but it still tore Yuki apart. Not because she doubted her decision, but because she had lost not just a husband but a future. All the plans they had made, all the dreams of growing old together, all the stories she had told herself about who she would be at 60 and 70 and 80, were suddenly gone. For 2 years, Yuki struggled. She dated occasionally but felt nothing. She threw herself into work but found it hollow. She traveled, volunteered, took up new hobbies, all in an attempt to fill the emptiness that divorce had carved out in her chest. And then something unexpected happened. Her mother became ill, and Yuki flew to Japan to care for her. She hadn't been back in over a decade, and being there stirred something in her. The language, the food, the way the light fell through the shoji screens, it all felt both foreign and familiar. One afternoon, while her mother napped, Yuki took a walk to a small Zen temple she remembered from childhood. It was still there, unchanged, as if time had passed it by. An old monk was sweeping the path, and when he saw her, he smiled and gestured for her to come in. They sat in silence for a long time, drinking tea, listening to the wind in the pines. Finally, the monk spoke. He said, in Japanese, "You are carrying something heavy. Would you like to put it down?" Yuki didn't know how to answer. She wasn't even sure what she was carrying. But as she sat there, tears began to flow. She told him about Kenji, about the divorce, about the years of struggling. She told him about the guilt, the doubt, the endless questions about whether she had done the right thing. The monk listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said something that she would remember for the rest of her life. In the forest, the trees that fall become food for the ones that remain. Nothing is wasted. Your marriage did not fail. It became compost. Compost. Such an ugly word for such a profound truth. But Yuki understood immediately. The 15 years with Kenji hadn't disappeared. They had become part of the soil of her life. They had fed her, shaped her, made her who she was. The ending wasn't a cancellation of all that had come before. It was a transformation of it. This is the wide web of human experience. Nothing is lost. Everything becomes something else. The love that dies becomes wisdom. The relationship that ends becomes capacity for future connection. The pain of loss becomes depth of character. It's all compost. It's all food for what comes next. Yuki flew back to Seattle with a different orientation to her life. She stopped seeing her divorce as a failure and started seeing it as a completion. She stopped mourning the future she had lost and started being curious about the future she was creating. She stopped asking whether she had done the right thing and started asking what the right thing was, right now, in this moment. 2 years later, she met someone. Not a replacement for Kenji, but a new person for a new version of herself. And when she entered that relationship, she entered it differently. Not looking for permanence, but open to presence. Not demanding guarantees, but offering honesty. Not trying to build a future that would never change, but committing to show up fully for whatever each moment brought. The relationship is still young. No one knows where it will go. But Yuki knows something now that she didn't know before. Whatever happens, it won't be wasted. It will become compost. It will feed whatever comes next. And that is enough. There's a particular kind of suffering that comes from loving someone who is still present but already gone. It's different from the grief of death or the pain of a clean breakup. It's a slow erosion, a daily diminishing, a death by 1,000 small withdrawals. You feel it in the morning when they reach for their phone before they reach for you. You feel it at dinner when the conversation runs out after 10 minutes and the rest of the meal passes in silence. You feel it at night when you lie back to back in a bed that suddenly feels too large. They're still there. They're still kind. They're still going through all the motions. But something essential has departed, and you can feel its absence like a missing tooth. This is the territory that modern psychology calls ambiguous loss. Loss without closure. Grief without a body to bury. The unique pain of loving someone who is psychologically absent even while physically present. The Buddha understood this territory intimately. He didn't use the term ambiguous loss, but he described its dynamics with precision. He taught that attachment to what is changing is the root of suffering. And what could be more changing than a person, a relationship, a love that is slowly, quietly fading? Let me tell you a story about a man named Samuel who lived in this territory for years and eventually found his way out. Samuel was a carpenter, 53 years old, married to a woman named Helena for 27 years. They had met when they were both in their 20s, fallen hard and fast, and built a life together that looked from the outside like a testament to lasting love. 3 children, a home they had renovated with their own hands, a small business they ran together. But somewhere in year 20, something began to shift. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. Helena seemed more tired than usual, but that was understandable. They were busy, stressed, raising teenagers. Then the tiredness became something else. A distance. A withdrawal. She was still there, still participating, but her presence had thinned somehow. Like soup that's been watered down. Samuel noticed. Of course he noticed. But every time the thought surfaced, he pushed it away. This is just a phase, he told himself. We're just in a rough patch. Every marriage goes through ups and downs. Years passed. The teenagers became young adults and left home. The business stabilized. The external stressors that might have explained the distance faded away. But the distance remained. Helena was still kind, still pleasant, still going through the motions. But the music had gone out of her. The light that used to come into her eyes when Samuel walked into a room had flickered and died. Samuel tried everything he could think of. He planned romantic getaways. He bought gifts. He initiated conversations about their relationship. He suggested counseling. Helena participated in all of it, cooperatively, pleasantly, but without any real engagement. It was like trying to revive a fire with wet wood. Lots of smoke, no flame. By year 25, Samuel had begun to accept something he had been resisting for half a decade. Helena wasn't coming back. Not because she was angry or resentful or involved with someone else. Simply because whatever had connected them, whatever had made them more than roommates, had quietly died. She was still there. She would probably always be there. But the marriage was over, even if it would never legally end. This is a kind of death that our culture has no rituals for. No funeral, no mourning period, no support system. Just the slow, daily erosion of living with someone who has already left. Samuel might have stayed in that limbo forever if not for a conversation with his daughter. Elena was 28, wise beyond her years, and she said something to him one afternoon that cut through years of denial. She said, "Dad, you're not honoring Mom by staying. You're just both slowly dying together." Real love would let her go, even if it hurts. The words landed like stones. Samuel wanted to argue, to explain that he was being loyal, committed, faithful. But something in his daughter's eyes stopped him. She wasn't judging him. She was seeing him. And what she saw was a man who had been slowly suffocating for years. Over the following months, Samuel did the hardest thing he had ever done. He stopped pretending. He had honest conversations with Helena, conversations where they both admitted what they had been avoiding for years. The love had changed. The marriage was over. What remained was friendship and history and the deep care of people who had shared a life. They made a decision together. They would separate, not bitterly but consciously. They would sell the house they had renovated together. They would divide the business they had built together. They would become something new, two individuals instead of one couple. The separation was painful in ways Samuel hadn't anticipated. But it was also, strangely, liberating. The ambiguous loss became actual loss, and actual loss, for all its pain, is easier to bear than the ambiguous kind. There's a clarity to it. An honesty. A clean wound rather than a festering one. Samuel is 60 now, 7 years out from that decision. He and Helena are friends, better friends than they were in those final years of marriage. They have dinner together sometimes, talk on the phone, celebrate their children's milestones as a united front. The love didn't die. It transformed. It became something that could survive the end of the marriage. This is what the Buddha meant when he talked about the middle way. Not the path between extremes, but the path between clinging and indifference. The path that allows love to change without requiring it to end. The path that honors what was without demanding it continue. The path that finds a way through the ambiguous loss to something real, even if that something is different from what we hoped. There's a Zen story about a monk who was chased by a tiger to the edge of a cliff. With nowhere else to go, he climbed down a vine that was hanging over the edge. Below him, he saw another tiger, waiting for him to fall. Above him, the first tiger paced and snarled. And then, in that impossible moment, he noticed a wild strawberry growing from the cliff face. He plucked it, put it in his mouth, and said, "How sweet it tastes." This story is not about denial. It's not about ignoring the tigers. It's about the capacity to taste the sweetness that exists even in the midst of danger, even in the face of certain death. It's about the human ability to be fully present with what is, rather than lost in fear of what might be or grief about what has been. When love is dying, there are tigers everywhere. The tiger of loss. The tiger of loneliness. The tiger of an uncertain future. And most people spend all their energy staring at the tigers, trying to figure out how to escape them, how to avoid them, how to make them go away. They missed the strawberry entirely. The Buddha's teaching is not about making the tigers disappear. It's about developing the capacity to see the strawberry even with tigers present. It's about finding the sweetness that exists in every moment, even moments of profound loss. Let me tell you a story about a woman named Iris who discovered this strawberry in the most unlikely circumstances. Iris was a potter, 48 years old, living in a small town in New Mexico. She had been with her partner, a woman named Grace, for 14 years. They had built a life together, a studio together, a community together. Their love was the kind that people wrote poems about, deep and steady and apparently unshakable. But nothing is unshakable. Everything shakes eventually. The shaking came in the form of a letter. Grace had been offered a position at a university in another state, a dream job, the kind of opportunity that comes once in a lifetime. Iris couldn't leave. Her aging parents lived nearby. Her studio was here. Her whole life was here. They tried to find a way to make it work. Long distance for a while. Visits on weekends. Plans for Iris to eventually join her. But the distance took its toll. The calls became shorter. The visits became more strained. The plans became more vague. 18 months after Grace moved, she called Iris and told her she had met someone else. She hadn't planned it. It just happened. The distance, the loneliness, the new life she was building, it all led to this moment. She was sorry. She would always love Iris. But it was over. Iris hung up the phone and walked into her studio. She didn't cry. She didn't throw things. She just stood there, surrounded by the pots she had made, the clay she had shaped, the kiln she had built with Grace's help. And she felt something she had never felt before. Not just grief, not just rage, but a kind of vast emptiness. As if everything inside her had been scooped out with a spoon. For weeks, she couldn't work. Couldn't eat. Could barely get out of bed. Friends brought food, sat with her, tried to help. Nothing reached her. She was in the grip of something larger than herself, something that seemed to have no end. And then, one morning, she walked back into her studio. Not because she felt better, but because she couldn't stand the bed anymore. She looked at the wheel, the clay, the unfinished pots. And she did something without thinking. She sat down at the wheel and put her hands on the clay. Nothing happened at first. Her hands moved mechanically, without feeling. But slowly, over minutes or hours, something began to shift. The feel of the clay, cool and responsive under her fingers. The spin of the wheel, steady and rhythmic. The concentration required to shape something from nothing. It pulled her out of her head and into her body. Out of the past and into the present. Out of the tigers and into the strawberry. She worked for hours. When she finally stopped, she looked at what she had made. It was ugly. Lopsided. Nothing like her usual work. But it was something. It was a moment of presence in the midst of absence. A taste of sweetness in the mouth of grief. Over the following months, Iris kept working. Not productively at first, just working. Showing up at the wheel day after day, even when she felt nothing. And slowly, imperceptibly, the work began to change. The pots became less ugly. The forms became more intentional. And Iris began to notice something unexpected. She was making things she had never made before. Different shapes, different glazes, different energies. The grief was not just destroying her. It was changing her. It was remaking her into someone new. This is the strawberry that the Zen story points to. Not the denial of suffering, but the discovery of what exists alongside suffering. Not the escape from tigers, but the capacity to taste sweetness even with tigers present. Iris eventually made a series of pots that became her most successful work. People called them innovative, original, unlike anything else being made. Iris knew different. They were grief pots. They were the shapes that loss had carved into her. They were the strawberries she had found on the cliff face. She still thinks about Grace sometimes. Still misses what they had. But the grief has changed. It's no longer a tiger chasing her. It's more like a companion, walking beside her, reminding her of what she has lost and also what she has gained. The capacity to be present. The ability to taste sweetness. The knowledge that even in the worst moments, there is something to be found if you're willing to look. This is what the Buddha taught. Not that suffering ends, but that suffering, when met with presence rather than resistance, transforms. It becomes something else. It becomes wisdom. It becomes compassion. It becomes the capacity to taste the strawberry even as the tigers circle. There's a concept in Buddhism that is often misunderstood. It's the concept of emptiness. When people hear that word, they think it means nothingness, void, absence. They imagine some kind of nihilistic void where nothing matters and everything is meaningless. But emptiness, in the Buddhist sense, means something entirely different. It means that nothing exists independently. Everything arises in dependence on conditions. Everything is empty of fixed, permanent, separate existence. You are empty of being a fixed self. The person you love is empty of being a fixed person. The relationship between you is empty of being a fixed relationship. This sounds abstract, even philosophical. But it's actually intensely practical. Because when you understand emptiness, you understand why love dies. Not because something went wrong, but because the conditions that supported it have changed. And when conditions change, everything changes. Let me tell you a story about a man named Victor who came to understand emptiness not through study but through the most painful experience of his life. Victor was a physician, 57 years old, married to a woman named Anita for 31 years. They had met in medical school, two young people with big dreams and endless energy. They had supported each other through the grueling years of training, through the early struggles of building their practices, through the challenges of raising two children. Victor would tell you, without hesitation, that Anita was the love of his life. He couldn't imagine existence without her. And for 3 decades, he didn't have to. But somewhere around year 28, Anita began to change. It was subtle at first. She seemed more tired, more withdrawn. Victor, ever the physician, suggested she get checked out. She did. The tests came back normal. He suggested she might be depressed. She saw a therapist. It helped a little, but the withdrawal continued. Then came the diagnosis that explained everything and nothing. Early onset Alzheimer's. Anita was only 54. It didn't make sense. It couldn't be happening. But it was. The next 3 years were a slow, agonizing decline. Victor watched the woman he loved fade piece by piece. First the short-term memory went. Then the ability to follow conversations. Then the recognition of friends, then family, then finally, Victor himself. There came a day, about 3 years into the illness, when Victor walked into Anita's room and she looked at him with complete blankness. No recognition. No warmth. Nothing. The woman who had been his partner for 3 decades, the mother of his children, the love of his life, was gone. Her body remained. Her breath continued. But Anita, the Anita he had loved, had departed. Victor sat beside her bed and wept. Not just from grief, but from a kind of existential vertigo. Who was this person in the bed? If Anita wasn't here anymore, where did she go? Had she ever really existed as the fixed, permanent person he had believed her to be? Or had he been loving a collection of conditions that had now dispersed? This is emptiness. Not the absence of Anita, but the recognition that Anita was never a fixed, permanent thing. She was always a process. A flow. A collection of changing conditions. The Anita of year 1 was different from the Anita of year 10, different from the Anita of year 20, different from the Anita in this bed. He had loved her through all those changes, but he had also, without realizing it, clung to the illusion that underneath all the changes, there was a fixed Anita who would always be there. The illness had stripped away that illusion. It had revealed what was always true. Anita was impermanent. Their love was impermanent. Everything was impermanent. Victor could have fallen into despair at this realization. Many people do. But something else happened instead. His grief, as vast as it was, became cleaner. He stopped waiting for Anita to come back. He stopped hoping for the return of someone who no longer existed. He started simply being present with whoever was in that bed, moment by moment. Some days, there were flickers. A brief moment of recognition. A faint smile. A squeeze of his hand. Victor learned to treasure these moments for what they were, not for what they weren't. He stopped measuring them against the past. He stopped demanding they last. He just received them, fully, while they were present. This is the practice of emptiness. Not denying the reality of love, but recognizing that love, like everything else, is a process rather than a thing. It flows. It changes. It arises and passes away. And our suffering comes not from this flow, but from our desperate attempt to freeze it, to make it permanent, to possess what cannot be possessed. Anita died about a year later. Victor held her hand as she took her last breath. And in that moment, he felt something unexpected alongside the grief. Gratitude. Gratitude for 31 years. Gratitude for the 3 difficult years of her illness. Gratitude for the teachings that loss had given him. Gratitude that he had been able to love someone so completely, even knowing, as we all know but rarely admit, that it would end. Victor still grieves. He still misses Anita. But he doesn't suffer in the same way. He doesn't fight against reality. He doesn't demand that things be different than they are. He has learned, through the hardest possible teacher, to love what is, even when what is includes loss. This is the freedom that emptiness offers. Not freedom from love, but freedom from the suffering that comes from demanding that love be permanent. Not freedom from grief, but freedom from the resistance that makes grief so much harder than it needs to be. Not freedom from loss, but freedom to experience loss cleanly, without the added weight of fighting against what cannot be changed. There's a teaching in Zen about the concept of beginner's mind. It means approaching each moment as if you're seeing it for the first time, without the filter of past experience, without the weight of expectation, without the stories you've been telling yourself for years. Beginner's mind is easy to access when you're actually a beginner. When you hold your first child, taste a new food, visit a place you've never been. But it's almost impossible to access in long-term relationships. By the time you've been with someone for years, you've accumulated so many stories about them, so many expectations, so many assumptions, that you can no longer see who they actually are. You see who you expect them to be. This is one of the reasons love dies. Not because the person changes, though they do. But because you stop seeing them. You start seeing your mental image of them instead. And that image, fixed and frozen, eventually bears no relation to the living, changing human being in front of you. Let me tell you a story about a woman named Priya who learned to recover beginner's mind after 22 years of marriage. Priya was an architect, 50 years old, married to a man named Dev for over 2 decades. They had met in college, bonded over their love of design, and built both a life and a successful firm together. By any external measure, they had it all. But Priya had been feeling, for several years, a growing sense of distance. Not dramatic distance. Not the kind that leads to fights or affairs. Just a quiet drifting apart, like 2 boats slowly separating on a vast ocean. She tried to address it in the usual ways. Date nights. Weekend getaways. Conversations about feelings and needs and hopes. Nothing seemed to reach the underlying drift. Dev participated in all of it, willingly, lovingly even. But something was missing, and Priya couldn't name what. The turning point came during a work trip. They were in Japan, consulting on a project, and had a free day in Kyoto. Dev wanted to visit temples. Priya wanted to see modern architecture. They split up, agreeing to meet for dinner. Priya spent the day alone, moving through the city with no agenda, no schedule, no one to accommodate. And somewhere in the middle of the afternoon, standing in front of a building that took her breath away, she had a sudden and startling realization. She had no idea who Dev was anymore. She knew his history, his preferences, his habits. She could predict his reactions, finish his sentences, navigate his moods. But she didn't know him. Not really. Not the way she had in the beginning, when every conversation revealed something new, when he was a mystery to be explored rather than a set of data points to be managed. The realization was devastating because it was so obvious. She had stopped being curious about him years ago. She had replaced genuine interest with comfortable familiarity. She had assumed she knew him, and in assuming, had stopped actually seeing him. That evening, over dinner, Priya did something different. She didn't talk about the day, the project, the logistics. She looked at Dev, really looked at him, and asked a question she hadn't asked in years. She asked, "What are you excited about right now?" Not the business, not the family, not us. Just you. What's alive in you in this moment? Dev looked at her strangely. The question seemed to come from nowhere. But he answered. He talked about a book he was reading, about an idea he had been turning over in his mind, about a fear he hadn't shared with anyone. And as he talked, Priya listened differently. Not as someone who already knew everything about him, but as someone meeting him for the first time. Something shifted in that conversation. Not the relationship, not overnight, but the quality of attention between them. Priya started approaching Dev with beginner's mind. Not assuming she knew what he was thinking. Not finishing his sentences. Not falling back on decades of familiarity. Just being curious, moment by moment, about who this person actually was. What she discovered surprised her. Dev had changed more than she realized. His interests had evolved. His fears had shifted. His dreams had transformed. The man she had been married to for 22 years was not the man she thought she knew. He was someone else, someone new, someone worth getting to know all over again. This didn't fix everything. The distance didn't magically disappear. But it changed. It became less about drift and more about discovery. Less about loss and more about finding. Less about mourning who they used to be and more about meeting who they were becoming. The Buddha taught that everything changes, including the people we love. But he also taught that this is not a problem to be solved. It's a reality to be embraced. The person you loved 5 years ago no longer exists. The person you love today will be different 5 years from now. The question is whether you can keep meeting them, keep being curious about them, keep seeing them with beginner's mind. Most relationships die not because love fades, but because curiosity does. We stop wondering. We stop exploring. We stop being present. And then we wonder why we feel distant from someone we stopped really seeing years ago. Priya and Dev are still together. Their marriage is different now, more alive, more present. Not perfect, nothing is. But real. Grounded in actual seeing rather than comfortable assumption. Built on curiosity rather than familiarity. Held together not by habit but by the ongoing choice to keep meeting each other, over and over, as if for the first time. This is beginner's mind in relationship. Not pretending the past doesn't exist, but not letting it blind you to the present. Not forgetting everything you know, but holding it lightly enough that you can still be surprised. Not abandoning familiarity, but allowing it to coexist with wonder. We've walked a long road together. We've explored the death of love from every angle, sat with stories of loss and transformation, touched the ancient wisdom that Buddhism offers for navigating impermanence. And now we arrive at the end, which is also a beginning. The Buddha's final teaching, the one he gave as he lay dying, was simple: be a lamp unto yourselves. Don't look outside for refuge. Don't cling to anything. Don't resist the flow of change. Be present, fully present, with whatever arises. This is the teaching for love as well. Be a lamp unto yourself in relationship. Don't look to another to complete you. Don't cling to what must change. Don't resist the natural endings that life brings. Be present, fully present, with whoever is in front of you, for as long as they're there. The love you've lost was real. It mattered. It shaped you. And now it's complete. That's not failure. That's not tragedy. That's just the way of things. The way of cherry blossoms and autumn leaves and all things that live and love and eventually transform. What remains after love dies is you. Not the you who was defined by that relationship, but the you who existed before it and will exist after it. The awareness that witnessed it. The presence that experienced it. The wholeness that was never actually broken, only temporarily forgotten. This is the freedom that becomes available when you stop fighting impermanence. Not freedom from pain, but freedom from the suffering that comes from resisting what is. Not freedom from loss, but freedom to experience loss cleanly, without the added weight of denial and clinging. Not freedom from love's ending, but freedom to love fully while it lasts and let go gracefully when it's done. If these teachings have touched you, if something in them has resonated, consider this your invitation. Your invitation to see clearly. Your invitation to let go. Your invitation to return to yourself. The path doesn't end here. It continues in every moment, in every relationship, in every ending and beginning that life brings. Walk well. Love fully. Let go gracefully. This is Monk's Temple, and we'll see you again soon.